Hello everybody, Glenn here. In this presentation I'm going to introduce you to my primary source, discuss some of the concepts I've encountered while researching in secondary sources, give some background information on the author of the text, which I find important, and then read from the text to provide an example of demagoguery. My primary is a novel. It's called It Can't Happen Here by the American writer Sinclair Lewis. It was originally published in 1935. And even though it's a work of fiction, I feel like it really does adequately demonstrate demagoguery as defined by Robert Miller in D&D and in some of the other sources that we've read over the course of the semester. It depicts a small-town, ambitious American politician named Berzelius Winthrop, or Buzz Winthrop, who uses demagoguery and fascism, which we might define as sanctioned political violence, to achieve power in what is an enraged and anxious and yet somehow still spoiled and distracted America. I want to focus specifically on how he uses personal charisma and also rhetorical fallacy. The rhetorical fallacy is found at the back of D&D to create a kind of us versus them scenario and to perpetuate this in-group, out-group perspective, which eventually leads to the removal and elimination of all political opposition. And that conforms directly, exactly to how Robert Miller defines demagoguery. On page 34 of D&D, we read that you can take almost any political situation, no matter how complicated, and reduce it to this sort of polarized us, the good, versus them, anybody else, who we define either to be evil or stupid. And that's all Buzz does throughout the novel. So I shouldn't have too much trouble framing him as a demagogue. But a few of the other concepts that I've come across are or concern demagoguery and democracy, and how it's particularly related to democracy and how it might not even be able to exist outside it. Secondly, can a demagogue really be sincere in what they're saying, or must the demagogue really not care one way or the other about the agenda, but just be using whatever populist tactics and flattery, right, persuasion by flattery, possible to achieve political power? And also, how much does narcissism and ego in the audience have to do with accepting the demagogue? I'm going to be using Kenneth Burke as a source in Rhetoric of Motives. We remember, you might have read, of course Burke was difficult to unpack, but we read essentially any attempt to persuade ultimately implies the need to combat conflict, and that rhetoric, even at its most diplomatic, aims to promote an alliance or this sort of sense of goodwill, remember, with the audience. And if you're gaining an ally, then that must imply an enemy. So I want to look at that some, because Buzz does that. And also look at this idea of ego and how maybe in a democracy there might be more narcissism because we have a voice, and because in a society where you're able to achieve with more resources, more things, and kind of these, having first world problems, are we able to evade demagoguery successfully, or are we actually more prone to it? These are things that I found some sources to cover, and they are absolutely central to Buzz Winthrop's strategy. I want to talk just for a moment about Sinclair Lewis. He was born in a place called Sauk Center, Minnesota in 1885, and he grew up resenting what he saw to be small-town values, closed-mindedness and short-sightedness, and a lack of critical thought, and maybe like sentimentality or hypocritical thought. But when he moved to the city, he found that lifestyle to be just as unfulfilling and flawed. Superficiality and materialism and this sort of vicious competitive spirit. So he spent the first 10 years of his career as a writer mocking those things, and he won a Pulitzer Prize. And then in 1930 was awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature right in the middle of his career. But apparently he did all that through a kind of good-natured humor. And at the awards ceremony for his Nobel Prize, they said he did it through wit and humor. But his wife, who was from Europe, was a journalist. And that same year, in 1930, she interviewed Adolf Hitler. And she was so terrified by the growing fascism in Germany and elsewhere in Europe that she went home and told Sinclair Lewis, "You need to write a more serious novel with sort of darker tone, to try to, with a more sobering kind of tone, as more serious social commentary." And so that put the idea in his mind. And then in 1933, when Hitler and the Nazis were elected to the Reichstag, he was sure that would be his next project. And I think that that's fascinating because Dr. Odom actually commented on that in one of our discussion board prompts when she put it in quotes, she said, Hitler was legitimately elected democratically. And that was something that terrified Lewis. And when he looked back at small town and big city life in America, and he saw that selfish greed and that ego and that sort of spoiled mentality, he thought this place is absolutely the most fertile ground for demagoguery. And so I think that should be something that I can try to frame in my paper. I want to read a scene for you here as my time expires. After Buzz Windrop is elected president, he establishes a martial law and this kind of Minuteman militia. They're called the Minutemen. And anybody who didn't vote for him, they call him anti-Buzz. Are you anti-Buzz? And so one of his lieutenants comes up with a little jingle set to the tune of Yankee Doodle, and it reads like this. The snakes disloyal to our Buzz were riding on a rail. They'll wish to God they never was when we put them in jail. Buzz and keep it up, to victory he's floated. You were a most ungrateful pup, unless for Buzz you voted. But the second verse is worse. Every Minuteman, every gets a whip to use upon some traitor, and every anti-Buzz we skip today we'll soon find later. So it's all about the scare tactics and the heaping blame on the other. And by the end of the novel, no one even remembers what side they're on. The women's auxiliary and the steelworkers don't care. They don't know what they have in common. They just know who they hate. I found this to be a fascinating project. I'm still working on it. But my overall goal is to take out selections from the text and to show how they demonstrate demagoguery as defined by Robert Miller and D&D. Thank you.